Hi guys, welcome back to Waxing On. It's Monday, and that means it's jazz. And today we're going to look at a trio of trombone players. I may have mentioned, if you remember back when we were talking about the Hannaford Street Silver Band, my brother-in-law being a trombone player, and over the Christmases he would often give me albums from trombone players that I had not heard of, just to kind of expand my knowledge of some of these performers. And I've got a couple of those albums here today, plus one that I picked up. So the first one we're going to look at, and this is another one of my favorites, Jack Teagarden. Now this one is called The Indispensable Jack Teagarden. And I don't know if you can tell, when I'm looking at it here, it's not in English, so I don't know a lot of what it says. So really I got to rely on Jack and his music to tell the story for me. Now, one thing I did notice on it, and this is another bonus for you, because if you followed our series for a while, a couple of notches in here usually denotes that this is probably a discount bin find. And I've had some excellent albums from the discount bins. This one covers Jack Teagarden. Again, a trombone player from 1928, this one until 1957. And during the 40s, during the swing era, of course, when you say trombone, first thing people think of are Tommy Dorsey and Glenn Miller. But Jack Teagarden was really in there swinging. He had played with Louis Armstrong, did a lot of recording with him. I think he was on Benny Goodman, the album we looked at during Benny Goodman's session. He did some guest on that too, a little vocals. So Jack was a vocalist and a trombone player. Reminds me of another Jack we talked about, Jack Sheldon, vocalist and trumpet player. But again, a very different take on the music of the time. A lot of Dixieland in here. We've got Gonna Stomp Mr. Henry, let me see, Tailspin Blues, Fare Thee Well, Christmas in Harlem, Darktown Strutter's Ball, Barrel House Music, Blues After Hours, Jam Session at Victor. This album, a lot recorded in 1929 to the early 1930s. I think there was only 4 songs recorded in 1957. But it gave a good cross-section of what Jack was doing at the time. And again, another trombone player that a lot of people hadn't heard of. Which leads us into another trombone player that, again, musicians knew, but not a lot of public knew. And this was another album from my brother-in-law, the great Fontana, featuring Carl Fontana. Now, I hadn't heard of Carl's name before, and if you've been listening to the show, you know I get most of my material from PBS or Downbeat. It was Downbeat that had talked about Fontana during a number of events out on the West Coast. Now, again, not really a household name. He played with Woody Herman, he played with Stan Kenton, but he was one of those guys that instead of staying on the road with the different bands, decided to settle down in Las Vegas and became a Vegas musician, backing up some of the biggest acts in the city. Just an off number here, Sammy Davis Jr., Tony Bennett, Wayne Newton, Paul Anka. I mean, he made a living working in the clubs or working in the halls at Las Vegas. And this is one of the few albums he recorded under his own name. And we've got a couple of guests on sideline with him here. We got Al Cohn on tenor sax, Richard Wines on piano, Ray Drummond on bass, and Akira Tana on drums. So just a small group. And he's doing things like Might As Well Be Spring, the Rodgers and Hammerstein tune, Soon by George and Ira Gershwin, Charlie Shaver's Showcase, Polka Dot and Moonbeams, a standard of a lot of jazz performers, and Shorty on a Riff by Sonny Clark. So a different side, a different trombone player that a lot of people, you may have heard him, but you wouldn't know who he was. He wasn't out front and center, he wasn't leading bands, he was sitting back in the section and supporting some of the great acts of the era. Now, in our other last trombone player, and I've mentioned him before during our Blood, Sweat, and Tears segment, Dave Bargeron. And this is one of Dave's solo albums. Now, he was with Blood, Sweat, and Tears, I think about 8 years. He did a lot of albums, starting with BS&T 4. And to me, he was really a standout performer. He was one that, at one point, I would have almost thought of switching over to trombone instead of trumpet, because I really loved what he was doing out there. I would love what he's doing in Blood, Sweat, and Tears. He was just a great performer, multi-instrumentalist. He'd be playing tuba, bass trombone, regular trombone. He could do it all. Once he left Blood, Sweat, and Tears, I think, well, I'm going to say after New City, a couple of years after that. He was still with them when I saw them. And I think it was New City they were touring behind in the early or the mid 1970s when I'd seen the band a couple of times. And again, he was certainly where my focus was. When he retired from Blood, Sweat, and Tears, he went kind of like Fontana into the studios doing studio stuff, a few things on Broadway or stage shows. And he started sitting in with Gil Evans, who was running a Monday night band at Sweet Basil in New York. And Gil, you know, great arranger. A number of albums, we featured him quite a few months ago on some of his albums, and as well as arranger for Miles Davis and some of those early albums in the 1960s. Well, during this period, he was holding down kind of an electric group on Sweet Basil's every Monday, and Dave Bargeron was sitting in his trombone. Now, what was unique there, first trumpet player for the band was Lou Soloff, who was an old bandmate from Blood, Sweat, and Tears. So we had the two of them back together performing. This album, Barge Burns, Slide Flies, is, again, a small group effort. Larry Willis is playing keyboard with them. And again, Larry Willis was with Blood, Sweat, and Tears with Dave for a number of years as well. A lot of original tunes by Dave, so not a lot of things people might know. We've got Children of Harlem by Larry Willis. There Is No Greater Love by Jones and Symes, and everything else is a Bargeron tune. Now, one thing they noticed in this, There Is No Greater Love, there was a song Dave's playing, and just to give you some idea of his abilities, there was a part where during his soloing he actually went up and hit a note which it would be the equivalent of double high C on trumpet. That's an incredibly high note. I mean, I'm nowhere close. I've heard guys do it. And high notes are not always everything. And I know trumpet players hate to hear me say that because, I mean, that's what they're all about. Who can play the highest, who can play the loudest. But to get a trombone player up playing that high was very unusual. You may remember back when we looked at the Woody Herman section, Phil Wilson had a great solo on one of those songs too, and he started an incredibly high note. Not a lot of people can do that and make it sound nice and make it sound like it fits the tune. But Dave Bargeron was an excellent player, one of my favorite trombone players. So today, a couple of people just to take a chance on, take a look at, see what they've got out there. They're not household names by any means, not like anything Glenn Miller or Tommy Dorsey, but we got Jack Teagarden, the great Carl Fontana, and ex-Blood, Sweat, and Tears performer Dave Bargeron. That's it for Monday. Hopefully you'll take some time, check those out on the streaming networks, or if you want hard copies as well. Take a look on Wikipedia, just find out a little more about these performers. But I think you'll find it certainly worth your while to give them a listen. That's it for today. We'll see you on Wednesday when it's Classic Rock. Till then, everybody stay safe. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you on Wednesday.